Hi everyone. In today's podcast, we are going to talk about the first African emperor, and I'm making reference to Septimius Severus. When we talk about Septimius Severus, we have to start mentioning about his background, his family, his father. We have to say that he was the son of a Punic father who had been granted Roman citizenship, and we know that the family also at some point became wealthy. Some of them they brought property in Italy, and we know that Septimius Severus was a well-known trained rhetorician. He was a friend of the poet Martial, and we know that he had a love for law, for Roman law, as we will see later on in his life. We know that he made important reforms into the legal code of law, and in fact, these were the basis for later on modern European laws based on the Roman code of law, thanks to the reforms of Septimius Severus. We know that some of his relatives, in fact, entered the Senate. Some of them became consuls. We know that they had influence, and at some point, even a branch of the family stayed in Leptis Magna, because it was in Leptis Magna where Septimius Severus was born in the year 145. We know that he had an elder brother known called Geta, and we know that he embarked in a senator's career in Rome. We know that in the year before Septimius Severus turned 20 years old, he entered the public life. In 162, in the year 162, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius awarded him the broad stripe for the senatorial order. We know that, in fact, we don't know many details about Septimius Severus' earlier career, but we know that as a young man, he studied law. We know that, in fact, it seems to be that he skipped some of the what people could consider the career or the path that usually people took towards, in this case, achieve honor. But it was because of the cleverness, because of the such a high level in laws that Septimius Severus achieved. We know that he achieved the or became a quaestor, and in fact he was first a quaestor in Rome and subsequently in Sardinia. We know that later on he was named one of the three legates by the emperor, and then later on he was even named proconsul in Africa. We know that even there's a famous story how he later on returned to Leptis Magna in North Africa, his hometown, and there's a whole story how someone came to him trying to be like over familiar, and Septimius Severus has had this person to be flogged because of such over familiarity towards a representative of the emperor. So we can see that Septimius Severus was a very strict man, and he knew what he wanted. He was a man pursuing a career, power, honor, and we know that in fact he served the emperor, and the emperor awarded him. We know that at some point in his life he married Patia Marciana, who was also a woman from Leptis Magna in North Africa, also from Punic descent. Um, they had no children, and we know that later on she passed away, and Septimius Severus took a second wife, of whom we are going to talk about very soon. We know that at some point he was appointed deputy head of the civilian administration of Hispania Tarraconensis in northern Spain, based on Tarragona. In the year 180, when the Emperor Marcus Aurelius died, his son Commodus became the emperor, and Septimius Severus received his first military posting, he was named commander of the 4th Legion Isitica in Syria. We know that it was there in Syria where he met his future wife, his future second wife, called Julia Domna. Julia Domna came from a priestly family, from a local cult, from a local cult in Syria, and there was a whole prophecy about. It was said that she was supposed to marry a king, and Septimius Severus was a very superstitious man, and in fact, there's a whole story how he even went to see the oracle of Baal, that in fact had a prophecy, a good prophecy for Septimius Severus, um, even saying of recognizing that he will achieve power and great status. We know that by 182, um, there were like different many intrigues in Rome, and another North African called Pertinax and Septimius Severus were dismissed from their Syrian commands. Septimius Severus then withdrew from public life. We know that he went to study in Athens. He was following religious purposes. We know that he went to see all the monuments and antiquities, and later on we know that later on he was called back by the emperor, and in fact we know that Septimius Severo gained an important position because he was appointed as legate of Gallia Lugdunensis, a governor. In fact, Gallia Lugdunensis, uh, we can say roughly that is North France today, with its capital in Lyons. We know that at this point, when his wife passed away, Patia Marciana, then Septimius Severus started looking for candidates or potential brides. And against this, we know that he was very superstitious and he had different dreams. He remembered Julia Domna, whom, according to the oracle, she was supposed to marry a very important man, or a king in this case. So Septimius Severus made sure that his destiny will be great. So he married Julia Domna, his second wife, and she bore for him their first son, Bassianus, later known as Caracalla, in April 188. They had a second son called Geta, who was born in 189. Of course, the career of Septimius Severus was, in a sense, he was later on named for 1 year proconsul of Sicily, and he got a consulship back in Rome. There was a very important change that happened within the empire, and is that another North African, Aemilius Laetus, was named Praetorian Prefect, and when Aemilius Laetus achieved this power, he named very key important figures into strategic positions within the empire. For example, we know that Aemilius Laetus name, in this case, Septimius Severus, in charge of the Upper Pannonia, in the Danube area. We know that he, in this case, name an Italian guy, his name Pesenius Niger, as in this case also as in front of the legions in Syria, and Claudius Albinus in front of the legions in Britain. Septimius Severus, as I mentioned, became governor of Upper Pannonia, and he had 3 legions at his disposal. We know that at this point he was a very important figure. Later on, when after Commodus the emperor was murdered, Pertinax, a North African, became for a brief short time emperor, and after he also was assassinated, there was a fight for the power between these 3 important and key figures, between Claudius Albinus, between Pesenius Niger, and between Septimius Severus. Immediately when Pertinax was murdered, the legions name Emperor Niger in Syria, and the soldiers name Septimius Severus Emperor, also proclaim him Emperor in the Danube area. So we have here an issue, and immediately Septimius Severus, since he was closer to Rome, he took his legions and started marching towards the capital of the empire, towards Rome. We know that Claudius Albinus, who was in Britain, also entertained similar ambitions of becoming emperor, but Septimius Severus was smart enough to keep him quiet for a while, though we know later on that Claudius Albinus started plotting with the Senate in order to overthrow Septimius Severus, because Septimius Severus took all his legions and marched, as I mentioned, to Rome. And we have to say that briefly there was a man named Didius Julianus, whom the Praetorian Guard had sold the throne after they had killed Pertinax. But when they find out that Septimius Severus was coming with all the army towards Rome, they murder also Didius Julianus, and we know that Septimius Severus entered the capital, and uh, we have what a Latin term, force majeure, which means that the Senate was forced to recognize, in this case, Septimius Severus as emperor. Immediately, Septimius Severus disbanded the Praetorian Guard and reconstituted with people of men of his own, and we know that in fact he kept Claudius Albinus, as I mentioned, Claudius Albinus quiet with false promises of the succession, and eventually he had to face Niger, and in fact they both armies collapsed in the year 194, and Septimius Severus defeated Niger, and we know that later on he went also in a series of campaigns against Niger's allies in Mesopotamia, and we know that, as I mentioned, the Senate hated Septimius Severus because Septimius Severus, we have to remember, it's true that his family had gained important recognition in Rome, but they came from North Africa, from Leptis Magna, from humble origins. And also the way Septimius Severus took power, the Senate was not happy with all of this. So they choose to support, in this case, Claudius Albinus, who in this case came from a senatorial family, and they start plotting against Septimius Severus. Immediately, we know that, of course, Septimius Severus declared himself to be the heir of Marcus Aurelius, and in fact, he renamed his family, or the Antonine family of the Antoninus, and in fact, we know that he finally had to face Claudius Albinus, and they had a battle in which Septimius Severus defeated him near Lyons, what is today modern day France, in the year 197. Finally, Claudius Albinus had no choice but to commit suicide, and we know that Septimius Severus had the body to be decapitated, and the head was sent back to Rome, and as a way, in this case, to keep quiet the senators and to show what would happen to anyone who dared to, in this case, confront the emperor. Immediately when Septimius Severus returned to Rome, he put to death 29 members of the Senate who had supported Claudius Albinus, and a lot of them, in fact, came from North Africa, from Africa Proconsularis, and that was very, very important to mention this because we have to again remember Septimius Severus himself came from North Africa. Immediately he started a series of reforms. We know that he started to reform the army. We know that a lot of his soldiers and people with military ranks started joining the civil life. He appointed them to governorships and senatorial positions, and we know that he opened the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard, we have to remember, was the personal guard in charge of protecting the emperor, and he allowed people from all over the empire to join the Praetorian Guard. In the past, that was not possible, but with Septimius Severus, now anyone from anywhere all over the empire. If he was qualified, he could join the Praetorian Guard. He was a very smart man, and he knew that his power depended on the army. He relied completely on the army, so he greatly increased the salary of the soldiers. He even allowed the soldiers to marry even when they were in the army, because before the Roman soldiers were only allowed to marry after retirement. But now they were allowed to marry even within the army. And he, as I mentioned, increased the salary and many other reforms. We know that Septimius Severus then traveled all over the empire. He went to Egypt and made different reforms in Egypt. In Egypt, he also visited the tomb of Alexander the Great. And there's a famous story that says that after he saw the remains of the great Alexander that were, in this case, preserved, we know that he ordered that the tomb should be sealed, so that he should be the last person to look on the great Macedonians' embalmed remains. And after that, until this day, no one knows where is the tomb of Alexander the Great. We know that, as I mentioned, he did a series of reforms, restructured the political and civil life in Egypt. We know that also he himself went on campaign against the tribes of the desert in North Africa. We know that in this case, um, the Third Augustan Legion under Anicius Faustus also played an important role in North Africa, as always. And we know also that there, of course, he had a series of monuments, especially in Leptis Magna, his hometown, and statues, and a series of modernizations, if we could call it, in this case, for the benefit of the people also, and as a propaganda, if we could say it. We mentioned earlier that he modified and restructured also the Roman law. We know that um, he called the great jurist Papinian, who was given preferment together with Ulpian and Julius Paulus, provided in this case the fundamentals of Roman law, which were eventually codified by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century and formed the basis of much of medieval Europe's legal system. Um, we have to, of course, mention that he had, of course, many enemies, and we have a famous contemporary writer, Cassius Dio, that describes Septimius Severus not in nice terms. We know that at some point there was a fighting that continued in Britain with the uh, native tribes, and Septimius Severus decided to go himself and try to stop these rebellions in Britain. And we know that, in fact, after 3 years of trying to stop these rebellions, and we know that he died in the year 211. But his legacy, we have to recognize, that was very important. He even extended a little bit more the frontiers of the Roman Empire, and we know that after his death, his son Caracalla, whose name was Bassianus, became in this case the successor of his father, and became the emperor. And of course, Caracalla is someone that we could later on make another video, another podcast about him, because it's a very interesting figure, and of course someone that history marks as someone despicable, someone that assassinated his own brother, Geta, in front of his mother. And the things that Caracalla did were really horrible things. So this is the end for this podcast about Septimius Severus, the first African emperor. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll see you all in the next podcast.